All right, so welcome back to part two of the data storytelling video. And there are three steps to telling a story with data. And so let's break down each of those and explain what goes into each of those. And the first step is you have to gather the data, right? You can't do anything related to a data story until you actually get the data. So there are several different ways to do this. Sometimes you just go and simply read the data. So, like on election night, for instance, all the reporters were going to the Secretary of State's website and clicking on general election and getting the election returns based off of the numbers that were coming into the Secretary of State. So you wouldn't necessarily download this data, but you could look at it and you could see, okay, Ted Cruz won with 51% of the votes. You can see how much Beto O'Rourke got. You can see how much the Libertarian got. You can see how many ballots were cast. You can see how many precincts have been reporting and all of those things. So we had 52% of registered voters vote in the election, which is an unusually high number for a midterm election. So you can get a lot of data just off simply reading sometimes information like that. For a lot of reporters, that's not enough, though. They want to download a data set. And one great place to get data is from the Census, as you might imagine. So the Census has this part that's called the American Factfinder, where you can enter in your city or your area and get information. So I just entered in Austin here. If you look, I could download just this data set about the 2010 census. So obviously it's old by now, but it's the last census that we have. And I can get information on the population, age, sex, race, household, and housing, all of those things from the 2010 database. So here it is in chart form. So that's where I could look at the information if I want to, but then I could also download this data and get it into a spreadsheet where I can then start to clean up the numbers and customize these numbers how I would want them to be presented possibly, which is one of the steps coming up here in just a little bit. So most of the times when you're working with data, you're working with spreadsheets and working with data that you're cleaning up. And when I say clean up, I mean put in the order that you want it to be in, get rid of information that you don't want in there, things along those lines. Sometimes you collect your own data. So this is something called an Arduino. This is just a sensor that you can use for a lot of different types of storytelling, whether it's air quality or temperature or so on and so forth. Usually the Arduino would it captures data and then reports it to some sort of spreadsheet, whether that's in Excel or in a Google Doc or something like that. WNYC, which is the public radio station in New York, did a really famous cicada tracker project involving Arduinos along the coast. So they knew the cicadas would make their way from Georgia to New England based on soil temperatures. So they started sending out Arduinos to all these people along the coast on the path that the cicadas take. And they could read the soil temperature to have a good idea of when the cicadas were actually going to make it to New York. I'm sure many of y'all have used Yelp or at least have heard of Yelp. And sometimes you partner with other people to get data. So for instance, when you go to Yelp, you will notice they partner, for lack of a better word, with Google to use Google Maps in their reviews. So Yelp could go in and create its own maps, but that would be kind of a giant waste of time, right? Because that's not the main part of Yelp. And there's already companies out there who have done this a lot better. So Yelp uses Google's products, and it does so through what's called an API, and that stands for Application Program Interface. This is a kind of a backdoor of sorts that Google or other companies that have a lot of data open up for other companies. Sometimes they have to pay to get it. Other times it's a free API access. Facebook gives away a lot of its API information for free as well. So Yelp is using Google's API to pull in those maps, use Google's data to pull in those maps so it doesn't have to create them on its own. And then sometimes you have to ask for the data. So especially when it comes to reporting, if you've ever heard of a FOIA, that actually stands for the Freedom of Information Act. And this is when reporters or newsrooms or anyone really goes in and requests public data or public information, usually from a government entity. So if you ever hear about FOIA or the Freedom of Information Act, it was signed in 1967. It provides the public the right to request access to records from any federal agency. So it you can see there it's often described as the law that keeps citizens in the know about their government, usually done through journalists. So we can request information from the police department or from City Hall or from the federal government as well. So that doesn't mean you're going to get it all times. And if you do get it, some of it's going to be blacked out. But that's what FOIA is. So sometimes you have to ask, and it might take a really long time to get that FOIA information released to you. But that's another way of getting the data. Data sometimes is very difficult to get. It's under lock and key, and especially federal agencies aren't too apt to give away data to journalists in particular. But it is an incredibly important part of the job that journalists do. And then sometimes you go out and create your own databases, and this is typically called scraping. This is just taking data from the web where it's otherwise not available to be downloaded or anything like that. So you would create a program to scrape all of that data from a website and then put it into some type of file that you could then use as a database. So for instance, the site AllMusic has an incredibly large database of artists, of CDs, of songs, of reviews, but it's nothing that you can actually download. It's just information on a website. So if you search for Paul McCartney, you can go to his discography and see every album that he's done. You can see what label he was with. You could click on the albums and see every song. You can see the critics' ratings. You could see the user ratings. Well, this is all data that you might want to use for a story, but you can't actually go in and download this data anyway. So if you wanted this information, you would build your own program, a scraping program, to go in and pull all this information and put it into a spreadsheet, because the information's all there. They just haven't made it available for you to download as part of their platform. So we get around that by what's called scraping. So step one is gathering the data. Step two is then understanding the data. And so just because you build a fancy infographic like this doesn't always mean it's going to make sense. But this is one of my favorite data storytelling pieces here, and it does make sense once you actually go in and stop and understand the data and what this data is looking at. So this is called Mountains Out of Molehills. It's looking at the number of media coverage of particular issues in time. So let's just take a look at a couple of these. So if you see this large pink column that's going in, that was around the year 2009. Typically in class, I would stop and ask if anybody knows what that is. But it was actually swine flu. So if you remember, swine flu got a ton of coverage. Whether it really justified that amount of coverage, again, the data might help you tell that story. If you look to 2014, 2015, that one might be a little bit more clear. That was the Ebola epidemic. And here in Texas, of course, we had the Dallas incident. So we felt the brunt of that Ebola coverage for a long time. Down here, you've got these green, pretty steady coverage over the years, but they spike up every once in a while. That would be vaccines. So you can probably guess back to school is when those peaks are happening. And then this one's always really interesting. If you look, this peaks twice a year. So I'll tell you, this is video game violence, and almost every single year it peaks twice a year. So if you stop and think, the one obvious time might be Christmas time, right? Because when people are potentially buying video games, news tends to do a ton of stories on video game violence, like are you knowing what you're buying for your children? But the other time that it peaks is every year on the Columbine anniversary, because Columbine was at least partially blamed on video game violence. So every time when Columbine's anniversary comes in, there's usually stories about video game violence. Here's something way more lighthearted in terms of understanding data. So if you just take a look at this, I'll stop and give you a second here so you can look at this and try to figure out what this chart might be trying to tell you. So you can see a lot of whatever it is we're charting here happens at spring break. There's a little uptick on April Fool's Day. Some happens during summer. And then right before Christmas is typically another time. So these are actually the most common breakup dates. And that it makes total sense, like spring break. There's a lot. You might be joking on April Fool's Day and then it turns into a real breakup. Mondays seem to be a pretty popular breakup day. You go away for summer right before Christmas. You don't necessarily want to buy Christmas gifts, so you might break up with your significant other as well then. So that all comes down to understanding the data. And then the third step in the data storytelling process is to communicate the data. So you don't have to have expensive, well-produced graphics in order to communicate the data. You can sometimes tell stories with just simple blocks. So this is one example. The dark orange box, which is the bigger of the two boxes, that's the total amount of meat consumption that we have around the globe. And then if you look, the orange box, which is about like 80% of it, is actually chicken consumption. So this tells you that almost all of our meat consumption is actually chicken that we're eating. Likewise, here's another example of this. I will tell you the little tiny orange box is the number of humans on this planet, and the kind of lighter shade of orange is the number of chickens on this planet. So again, two very simple graphics, but they helped communicate that data story that goes along with that data set. Politics does this a lot. So this is something you probably saw that went viral after Hillary Clinton won the nomination for the Democratic nomination for president a couple years ago. What this was saying was every Democratic nominee for president, and then you had Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton at the end of it. So that was one way to help tell that story, which is a data story in a graphic form here. The New York Times and other newsrooms have been using these percentage needles every election. So we saw it again here in the midterms. The New York Times meter, or the needle as they call it, helped, or was one of the big stories of the night when Donald Trump won the presidency, because it had started at like 85% of a chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And then there was a very sudden shift in the percentages based on the numbers that were coming in. And so people were watching that needle like crazy to see where the election was going and who was potentially going to win. This brings up 538, so I'm not going to show this video right now, but I do want you to watch it. It's going to introduce you to Nate Silver and his team at 538. I'll link to this in the email that I send out, so let's just go ahead and keep going for right now, but please do go back and watch 538. So why should you use data to tell stories? Well, for one, they provide a ton of depth to a story. Especially, deep investigative stories are going to have some sort of data to back up the investigation that's going on there. So a lot of times the biggest and best stories that you see usually have some sort of data component to it as well. Data is highly customizable, so it can bring the reader or the user into the story because they can go any direction that they want to go based off of the data that is important to them. And then probably the most important for newsrooms in particular is that these stories have a super long shelf life. So if you have a really interesting data set, it can continue to bring people to that story for years and years. So if you think about the Texas Tribune's Government Salaries Explorer, this is still one of their most highly trafficked pages, even though they created this data set several years ago. But people still continue to go to it because the data set is that good. And it's that interesting that people want to be a part of that. So every story, or I should say just about every story, has a data angle. It's up to you if you want to pursue that data angle or to figure out if that data angle is worth pursuing and might help lend some beef or some depth to a story that might need it overall. There is a quiz related to this lecture, so please go to Tracks. Go to the assessments page on Tracks and you'll see a data quiz there. So please make sure and take that quiz before Wednesday at 4:59 p.m. And don't forget to watch the Nate Silver 538 video that I'll also be linking as part of this.